Lisa Harrison here, and today I'm speaking with Stephen Strong, ex-school teacher and author of 3 books, The Forgotten Origins, Constructing a New World Map, and Mary Magdalene's Dreaming. And Stephen, I've been really looking forward to this because I have mentioned you and your work several times, many times actually, over the last month or so in interviews that I've done on radio. And I know there are lots of people out there, because they've been messaging me, asking for more. So I've really been looking forward to this. So thank you for it.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Lisa.
But just before to get into this, if you could just cover off the 3 books and the information that they focus on.
Okay, then. Yeah, well, actually, to begin with, the first 2 books were one book. But when we went through University Press of America, they didn't like the idea of putting science and archaeology together and with religion, so they split them up. So the first book looks more at the mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosomes, and the reasons why the Aboriginal people are separate from the African people. And we go through and look at different historical accounts, different forms of science that validate that belief. And we look briefly at the religion. Whereas in the second book, we look more at the dreaming as it came through different religions. And particularly we look at Gnosticism, the Christian form of what I call the dreaming. And we look at the similarities there, and we find that the same thing we found through history and mitochondrial DNA and science, the same principles of the dreaming seem to be spread through all the religions. And the third book is more of a melding of those 2 things again. So we're looking at the different ways the dreaming is spread throughout the world. We look at science, history, religion, historical accounts, whatever's available. We come back to the same story.
What is the information all coming back and telling you? What was the mitochondrial information you said showed that the Aboriginals and the Africans were separate? So is that confronting the out of Africa theory for humanity?
Yeah, I think it is in 2 ways. I think firstly because people were comfortable with the belief that we came out of Africa, and they've made up a history based around that, based around our migration from Africa. And within it, some inherent belief that we're rather aggressive animals because we came out of the jungle and all the sort of trappings that go with that. This is different simply because it says, no, look, there are many people who believe in what's called multi-regional emergence of Homo sapiens. Very few think that it came from Australia first. And the difference we throw into the equation is we look at the mitochondrial DNA and we look at the studies. And what most people don't know is the 2 people who wrote the paper that came up with Eve and out of Africa, Rebecca Cann and Ellen Wilson, both within 10 years recanted and said they got it wrong, that it was Australia. Now, that's because of the fact that in Australia there's a massive diversity of mitochondrial DNA. Now, what that means is that passed on from mother to mother. And once every 3,500 years, you get what's called one mutation. Now, what we're finding in Australia, and that's what Cann and Wilson found when they came down and studied here, is there was a huge amount of variation here, more than anywhere else on this planet. And both of them nominated Australia as the beginning point. And they changed from Africa to Australia. Now, we're finding that there's study after study, and recently they did one what's called genome sequencing. And from that, they decided the Australian Aborigines go back to equal first with the Africans. And the reason why they put the Africans in front is because, according to the history books, they got to Australia 50,000 years ago. Therefore, that means that they were behind the Africans. But we don't believe that. We believe the Homo sapiens began in Australia first and emerged from Australia and went to other places. So we see the whole thing reversed. We see it all beginning here first.
So not the multi-regional. You are pinpointing it specifically to Australia, and for whatever reason, whatever drove them off this landmass, they then went forward from here and populated the entire planet.
Yeah, look, we're comfortable with a multiracial theory where there could be other Homo sapiens coming out after the Australian Aborigines. I can't be specific and say, and I know some elders have said that all other peoples come from us, and that's a direct quote. I think that's most likely the case. I believe the Australian Aboriginals were sailing from here a long, long time ago, and maybe these other races are offshoots of that. Or it may well be the Africans are a different race. I'm not 100% sure on that. What I am sure is that the Homo sapiens start here first and that they sailed to those other places. Now, whether there are Homo sapiens there when they got there as well as, and there was interbreeding, or there wasn't breeding, and I think in America there's a case there wasn't. I think that's a different story. But what I can tell you for sure is the first Homo sapiens was certainly Australian. The Africans, I'm not sure about that. I can go either way with that. There may well have been an African strand there as well as. There is some genetic proof that is the case, or it may well be that the Aboriginals got there much easier to Africa than we think.
So we're not really taught that Aboriginals were seafaring. It's not
No,
a big
we're
part of
not.
not a big part of their story.
No, it's a huge part of their story. And what we're finding right now out in the field is the amount of astronomy that's taking place here. They're now talking about Wurdi Youang, which they thought was twice as old as Stonehenge, being 4 times older. And that's a massive construction in Victoria. I've seen constructions of 50,000 rocks put together to mark out celestial meetings, 15,000 rocks at Lake Jindabyne that mark out planetary alignments. We're looking at 2 places, both referred to as Stonehenge around here. And I've seen compasses, one of them, an amazing construction, all in this region, and they're ancient. And we have seen hundreds and hundreds of astronomical markers. The people around here were obsessed by the stars. And when I was giving ceremony the first time by the Ramanjeri, they gave me the part of one story. They said I was allowed to talk about that story, and that says that in ancient times, Australian Aboriginal mariners sailed around the world in a figure 8. Now, that always was tricky because you can sail around the world by accident, but when you nominate the way you go, that means you understand where you're going and you can map it, which means you must have astronomy. It was interesting. I remember when they told me that, I thought, well, that's going to be easy because I don't have that information. And I got a phone call, and 2 days after the phone call, when I was told to look for astronomical evidence and I had none, we started picking it up. 2 days after that, I was told to do that. And what we've found now is Australia is just full of astronomy. And that's simply because they understood where the stars moved. They tracked the planets. They tracked solstices. I think we might have even found a lunar calendar in one place in Gosford. They tracked everything that was taking place, including plasma events, that's explosions from the sun. It's all in Australia because when they sailed, they had to know where they were going and how to get back. And they can only do that through mapping the stars. So it's no surprise astronomy is the oldest here. In fact, the only book written on astronomy in Australia is written by Hugh Cairns and it's called Dark Sparklers. And he claims they went back at least 30,000 years. Stonehenge is 5,000 years. So it's ancient here.
And we're not even told that they built anything. That they left no markings apart from some scratches in the rock. You know, that they weren't into construction of any description.
No, they did. Look, we found stuff. We found so many different forms of markings. Went to a cave quite recently, probably 2 weeks ago, called the Cave of the Emu Prints, and inside there, the emu prints are astronomical markings. Inside that cave, there were hundreds of emu prints on top of emu prints in different directions. And I remember asking the elder, what's this doing in a cave? Doesn't that normally mark upstairs? And he said, of course it does, but this is a special cave. In that cave alone, there would have been 150 markers. That's just in one spot. We found emu prints in different places. And then we found sun disk in a different tribal area where they mark them out differently.
What do you mean by emu prints, though? You're not talking about a footprint of an actual emu. Are you talking about a scratching that resembles?
Yep, the carving to make out the looking of an emu, because an emu print, it's meant to mark out the astronomy. It's meant to mark out star signs and stuff, and they use that all the time. But these caves around here, especially where we've been looking, they've got astronomy everywhere. No, we're not taught that. And bear in mind, as we now know, Wurdi Youang is agreed as the oldest astronomical marker in the world. Now we're going back to 20,000 years, and I think we can go back even further. This stuff is definite and it's science. It's just not spoken about because it doesn't quite fit.
Well, no, the whole of academia is going to have to rethink and rewrite some books, aren't they?
Well, they should, because look, even the idea when we talk about something like this, when we talk about astronomy, you've got to remember that even that concept is wrong because the Aboriginal people don't talk about the stars like we do. They talk about the dark spaces in between. They look at the whole story differently to us. We see the white, they see the shapes that makes. And I know that in that book, Dark Sparklers, Bill Harnley was talking about the place where his people go to reincarnate. It's called rock cod dreaming. And you look up there and you see the shape of the rock cod created by the actual the stars. So we look at this, they look at this much differently to us.
Right.
And as they say, as on top, so below. So everything is interrelated. So the stars for them are an important part of their life. Now, when I got a ceremony down with the Ravengeri, next time we go down to a place called Carter, which is Kangaroo Island. And there, what takes place there is when you die on the mainland, a lot of the mainland Aboriginal people, their soul goes to Kangaroo Island, goes to one place and ascends back up into the sky and waits to reincarnate again. But again, it's a shape again. So they're in a relationship with the stars. It's not just like we've got where there it is up there. They have a relationship with their soul.
So
It goes back.
reincarnation is very much a part of their spiritual beliefs as well.
Oh, yeah. Traditionally, yes, it is. Yeah, yeah. They believe that. That's why the worst punishment an Aboriginal person could get in their own tribal land would be freedom, be set free. That means banishment, which means you never come back to country. And what that means is when your soul dies, you can't reincarnate. If you're killed on country, you'll die, the soul will wait, it'll come back again. There's normally an arrangement between the spirit and the mother, and you go back to that country and you become part of that country again because you're a person. If you're banished and given freedom, your soul can't reincarnate, it just wanders forever. It's lost. So that relationship goes all the way back.
Now we know that most cultures from around the world, the old cultures, have been sharing their information in regards to 2012, their their spiritual information, their prophecies. But the Aboriginals here in Australia have remained quite closed-mouthed until recently. And what is it that do you believe that has triggered them to start talking? Why are they talking to you? And what do they want us to know?
Well, they are talking and they are concerned. And I've been spoken to by so many elders who've made an issue of the fact that we get this information out this year, we get it out now. This year they consider to be incredibly important. They do not refer to the Mayan calendars. They don't refer to the steps in the pyramids. They don't talk about that. They're aware of it, but that's not what they base it on. I've been told so many times this year is important, but it's different. Their message is coming from their spirits and coming from the land. I've heard quite a few of them tell me about the fact that they can hear the land groaning under the strain of what's taking place at the moment. I can't hear it, but they can, and I don't just question that for a second. I
So
know
this
that,
so this year is important because now they can hear the earth talking to them.
yeah,
Not
definitely very important, and they see it all the time. The lockout, the lockout that's taken place at the moment, the gates down and down at Roxby Downs there. That was because the lizard spirit there, when that big dust storm came out, that was it actually cleaning itself and cleansing itself of all the mining that's taken place there. They are telling us the land will take no more, and they actually are quite insistent.
so they knew a time was coming, a time of change was coming, but it wasn't calendar driven. It's event driven.
Yeah, look, I've heard them. I've heard this other prophecy that they knew we were coming. The whites were coming to this country because it was the Garden of Eden. If you think about it, 300 years ago, we're all naked here, and everyone was wandering around, sharing everything. Everything was fine. They knew we were coming. It was like a collective karma they had to go through suffering for. And I've heard many times them talking about the number of generations, which works out to be about 200 odd years, where they went through this first before their time would come back. So yes, I've heard that.
Okay.
I've heard that for quite some time, but I didn't see them being this specific until this year, where the information, where we've basically been overloaded with information, but it's always been with a caveat. You get it out quickly. That's why we've got two things coming out on YouTube in the next couple of weeks, because we have got some people doing documentaries, but such was the importance that this get out straight away. That will take years. That's why this will come out in a couple of weeks, because I'm under that directive constantly. Get this out now, get it out now. The stuff I'm going to be shown, I've got new stuff that it looks like I'm going to be shown, which will really rewrite history. But the same rule applies. You have to get it out yesterday because this year's important. They believe they want all their message out, all the truth of the past out this year. The Ramangeri call it Wirrichin, blackfella, whitefella dreaming, where everything gets shared. And that's why they're giving up information when I go down there again, for the same reason.
So what is it they want you to tell us now?
Look, it's not just the fact that the history of the past is so wrong. Aboriginal history, they were the centre of the ancient world for so long, till about maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years. The people sailed here for quite often. That's all part of it. But there's a parameter that's wrong here. And that is this. We've been taught when we're in kids, when we're in the classroom, when we do history, we learn about different wars, different conflict, different people taking over other countries and stuff like that. And we've been taught that the survival of the fittest, this sort of concept of us being warlike human beings, is part of our natural way of being. The Aboriginal people, they also had fights, but you couldn't go on someone's land and take anything. You didn't go in and steal the children or rape the women and do those sort of things. You fought on neutral grounds. Once the fight was completed, you went back to your place because you owned that place. It was part of you. You were the custodian of that place. You could never take it. And everyone knew that. So there was a different setup here. And I think what we need to understand is that we are cooperative, spiritual human beings. This is what we're meant to be, and this is what the dreaming is about. And I think that our history up until 5,000 years was of a cooperative race of people living on this planet, all with a spiritual goal and an understanding of the past and future, an understanding we come back and why we come back and all the things that make up life and death. That was given then. It's been taken over the last 5,000 years. That's part of the history they want back out. You see, they want this for their own people, the ones that are suffering, and for us that are suffering too. Their spiritual lesson, that's why the Egyptians came here, why the Phoenicians came here, why different people came here, was they were the spiritual masters of this planet. Therefore, they didn't have the material trappings that we have, but we think mark out civilization. So they had a different situation and a different approach to life, and that was that everything was spiritual. And there's a well-known saying, according to Aboriginal people in traditional times, everybody had some magic. Today, virtually none of us do.
So we're not just looking here at rewriting the anthropological history here of where we originated from and where civilization originated from, but we're also talking about rewriting our concepts of human nature and what it is to be a human being and what it is to be a spiritual being. We're talking about rewriting all of that, aren't we?
We are, because, look, that's what this is really about. The Aboriginal people, or the original people, I should correct myself there because that name Aboriginal causes issues. The original people were living differently to any other race. If you go to every other continent, you'll see two things that aren't here. Number one, farming was banned from here. The caging of animals was banned from here. Number two, warfare, where you could take another person's history, because that's the first thing that happens in warfare. The history is rewritten. And that's why we should honour oral history here, because it was never rewritten by someone who came in to sanctify and justify their theft of country and people. So there's a difference that took place here. And this was the way we were supposed to live. We were supposed to live like this. And this is why the Aboriginal people, or the original people, up to 250 years ago, were still living the last bastion of the way we should live.
So when they did have issues, when they had problems with their neighbours, and they wanted to work it out, and they did it through war, their version of a war. Give me an example, because you've told me this, you've given me other examples in the past, but share with people what sorting out their differences would look like.
Okay, look, that's a great example, and I might have given it to you before, but it's the best one I can think of, and because it's from what's called Bundjalung territory, but there are 13 tribes here, so we won't go down there. But anyway, we'll use that for now. There was a wonderful story in the 1850s in Lismore at the showground. At that stage, Lismore was quite small, probably about 400 or 500 people, and there was a meeting of all the different tribes, Midjinbul, the Weebull, Githibal, Yagle, all the different Bundjalung speaking groups sort of came together because it's more a language, and they fought in the Lismore showground over grievances. Now, the grievances were always over women and sometimes over spiritual offence caused, but nothing else. There was nothing else you could fight over. So what it was decided was they went and told all the whites to leave, and two guys that fought in the Napoleonic War camped on the top of the hill for 3 days and watched it took place. He said the fighting was more ferocious than anything they'd seen. And he watched as one group of maybe 1,500 were fighting and throwing spears, and the other group was throwing backwards and forwards, and one group was taking over and winning. So they stopped, and one tribe from one group joined the other group to even things out. And they said after 3 days of the most amazing fighting and really powerful men fighting each other, every human being walked away. Some limped, some hobbled, but no one died. There were rules. You didn't hit them in the head. You didn't hit in the groin. There were certain rules in hand-to-hand contact. Secondly, when they threw the spears, they had shields, so they would always deflect. It was a way of releasing what some men always carry in them, the testosterone and the anger. After 3 days, they walked away friends, and for another 20, 30 years, there was no more resolution, nothing to fight over, because it was all gotten out. All the deep-seated resolutions, when that, maybe, I think it was in the Narukbal tribe, swapped sides. They had issues with the other group they had to sort out, so that was done too. It was like a huge game of football, but the rules were set. So the people, again, blood was drawn occasionally, and people were, sometimes legs were pierced, but they all walked away. And the women were always in the background. You must understand that even within a tribal dispute, if two men started to fight, they could only fight if a woman was there watching and the woman would decide when to stop. So there were rules about this all the way through where the women were in the background even during the war to make sure the men didn't get carried away. That got lost. And once that got lost and taken, we got our history taken away. And I think what the Aboriginal people, the original people, are offering for themselves and for us is a different way at looking at things, where the spiritual is the most important, and family and tribe comes everywhere. And way down the bottom comes money and possessions. That's what we've got to learn.
So did the women call an end to this at the end of 3 days?
I can't say for sure whether women did or didn't, but I do know that why that fighting was taking place. As the spears went past, they would collect the spears and hand it back to the men. And if a man was actually hurt and speared, they would collect. And, of course, the men wouldn't throw while the women was coming on there. They would collect the men and then repair them, and then they go back and fight again. And I do know that the women are always, you can make a bet about this, and as women have always told us, if you call men's business, I know Auntie Minnie told me this, you've got to be joking, because when the men come back, they would tell the women what took place. There was nothing we didn't know. And it was official and unofficial. It was men's business, women's business. But yes, the women, whether they'd stopped the fight, whether they started the fight, they were in the fight. They were orchestrating the fight, and they were arranging the fight, and they were repairing the fight. There was nothing like that. Look, quite recently, we found out that the Gosford glyphs, which we thought the actual glyphs themselves were men's business, only men went there. I only found out recently, a couple of weeks ago, Auntie Bev Spears told us that the women would go there and actually keep them looking fresh by rubbing women's urine into this so-called men's site. Within 200 metres of this men's site, there is a grandmother's tree. Men's business, women's business. I'm not so sure about this anymore. I really don't think it's cut and dried as we think. And I think you'll find the women were involved in every business, men's business and women's.
Extraordinary. And the other part that's coming out is the role of the matriarch and the grandmother in particular, perhaps, but the role of women in the tribe, in the mob, and how integral they were in maintaining the integrity of the tribe.
Look, I think that never stopped too, by the way, and people have got to understand a lot of the stuff that people think Aboriginal people lost, they never lost. They just kept it secret for a while. But one thing that never was kept secret, and I was in Moree watching the same thing again, It's during the time we took away the men's dance, the men's language, the men's secret activities, the hunting, the cutting of the boys, taking all that thing out. It was the women who held the tribes together all over the place. When the men started to drink and despair, the women kept things going all the way through. They always have. Look, Daughters of Dreaming, Daisy Utamora, took on Diane Bell to stay there for 18 months and shared a few things. And the first thing that Diane Bell worked out was you can forget this idea of there being an inequality there. There is one. The women are slightly more revered and slightly more important than the men. That's the inequality that she learned straight away. Daisy Utamora would point out some of the clever fellas there and see that one over there, she'd say, we're going to give her a bit of women's business. We're going to give him a bit of women's business, because there's magic that the women had that the men never had. And there was it's a beautiful creation system there where the men sort of carried, that's why the women didn't touch points and blades, because they create. Men don't do that. And I love the way nearly in all, not all, but nearly all stories of creation are an arrangement between the spirits and the women. The men aren't part of this. And I think that's really important. They guard, they protect, and they love the children, and they treat them differently than white men do, but they don't actually become part of the creation process. And I think that's very important because it humbles the men. They may be able to kill the creation process, but they can't start it. And which is the greater act? They know which is the more important act. So there's something within their system of religion and dreaming that can never be taken away. And that's why when you look at the tribes and you look at the tribal system, I've been told, and I think it's pretty right, there are 2 patriarchal tribal systems in Australia and all the rest are matriarchal. So when you look at it just from that level alone, with the exception of 2 tribal systems, the women are basically officially running the show anyway. And the other 2, I will guarantee you, it'll be unofficial. It just won't be quite as obvious.
How do you mean by the men treat their children differently to whites? In what sense?
Well, there's a beautiful accounts of finding, and I'll use the accounts of the first white settlers and explorers, finding the pickaninnies, because you could find the camp of an Aboriginal place kilometres away by miles away, by the laughter of the children. So that they reckon they could find them. It was so easy to find them, so easy to sneak up on them because the children were always laughing. What they found was that they found the men and the women and the men, and I'll use the words of one of the first explorers, ridiculous indulgence for the children. They have such a love for children. You see, up until this time, and children is actually given that first strong initiation, they are allowed to do anything, and their main job is just to have fun and enjoy themselves. So the men and the women spend a lot of time nurturing and making sure the children are laughing. In fact, it's obligatory that is the case. And you think about our children at the same time, spare the rod, children should not be seen and shouldn't be seen or heard. Here, the children were first and foremost in the tribe. Everything was based around the children, everything. If you remember, many of the battles in America were won simply because the cavalry threatened the women and children. That is the truth. And that's why the men would give up. And that's what even Custer tried to do. He was trying to capture the women and children. He knew that they would give up if he did that. And he sent his best men to try and bring them down. We know that works simply because there's such a difference in the system there. So, yes, the children are the base of it, but the women are the creators. You see, if you go right back to the very beginning, there's a very, very early creation story, and I never get pronunciation right, but I know the story. It's called the Juanu or something like that. And it's about 2 women that carry a sacred dilly bag, and in it is all the magic, and everything is inside that bag. And their brother, one of the brothers, steals it and takes it and is found out. And the other sister says, well, you'll kill your brother, because you've got to remember, very hard laws here. But that's why they had these laws to make things so that people did understand this is how you should behave. And she said, no, I won't kill him. And I'll let him have that dilly bag simply because this magic we already have, he doesn't. And we can create, we have a uterus. He will never have that. So he needs to learn our magic so he can get up to our level. So there's an implication there that the women's magic is more powerful than men's magic. And where we are, we have a story about the Durangan up at Blue Knob. And she would initiate the clever fella. If you want to be a clever fella, a man, you would go up to her for 4 months. And after 4 months, she would tutor you and give you skills. And at the end of 4 months, you would walk out onto a ledge and then step forward. If you stayed aloft and you levitated, you were a clever fella. If you fell, you weren't. And then, of course, if you did fall, she would catch you anyway because she's way too clever for the clever fellas anyway. And there's the same truth again. That it is a clever woman that initiates the men into this mysticism that a lot of people think is a male thing. It is not. It's shared. And as I've often been told, the women have a little bit more than the men. And that seems to be a common.
Well, let's move on to what's happening this year and what they want us to know about what to expect this year and beyond, and also the Palladian connection, because that keeps coming up time and time again.
It does. It does actually. The Pleiadian connection is a bit of a bugbear for us because we've written 4 books now and not mentioned the word UFO, and we've probably written 20 articles, been published, fairly long ones, not mention UFO. I'm now at the stage now where I have deliberately kept away from it. And I'll explain why. I was at a meeting recently. We're trying to set something up here with Blackmores. And we're talking about the different parts of what's going on there. And they did ask about the theory and how it linked up. And somebody, not me, mentioned UFOs. You should have seen the reactions of the people from Blackmores. It was like, my God, someone had stuck pokers in their eyes.
This is the Blackmores health food company.
Yeah. Look, it's a common one because it's funny. The majority of people in this planet do believe in UFOs, right? You'll do survey after survey. But I swear to you that 99% of all the academics are on the other group because it's like a poison chalice to bring it up. So it's with the greatest reluctance I even mention Pleiades. Now, I do that because of 2 reasons. Firstly, because when I was initiated or given ceremony, I was told I would, and I was told the whole of what we had was right except that part. It's because every elder we've spoken to in the last year and a half has deliberately brought up Pleiades and spoken of the 7 sisters and said things like, our ancestors come from there, we come from there, very, very specific about it. But now we seem to be running into proof in archaeology that what they're saying is actually true. And that's a step forward, and that's why I'm starting to talk about it more than I want to.
What kind of proof?
Well, that's the trick. In the 2 YouTubes we're going to point out, there's a place called the Gosford Glyphs. It's been rubbed down by everyone that says, oh, no, it's a hoax, it's a hoax. It's not.
When were the Gosford Glyphs discovered?
Well, there's the trick. Somebody says the person who's discovered them, who's a surveyor, said he found them sometime in the 70s. I find that fascinating because a surveyor working for the council, you'd think they'd actually mark it on a diary and be able to be more specific. He claims there was nothing there and then it's a fake and then people put things in there. We quite recently, and we've got an interview with the ex-sites officer for National Parks and Wildlife who found it. Well, actually, it was shown where it was found by National Parks and Wildlife and the last Darking Young Elder. And they both nominate that as Egyptian. And what's interesting in both cases is the fellow that found it in 77, 78 said it was full of rubbish and it took 2 trips to get all the rocks, the trunks, the litter and dirt to clean it out to find what was there. Now, according to someone 2 years earlier, they walked in and it was clean. So one of the 2 groups is lying. It is that simple. It is either being covered up for a long period of time. We have accounts in the 1950s saying they saw it then, and we've got King Bunbury's account in 1896 saying that the Carry-on people knew of a story of some people, 2 brothers who came from a long way off, and one of them died there, was bitten by a snake, which is supposed to be what's on those 2 walls. So there's a story about this place. It could be fake, it may not be, but we've got an interview with the National Parks and Wildlife Sites Officer saying it is legitimate, and we have an interview with the last Darking Young Elder said it is Egyptian. So what we're going to do is we're going to take their words. We've got those 2 people. I've spoken to them both, and they're honest people, and they tell me that this is Egyptian. And in there, between those two walls, are around about 300 hieroglyphs. And when you look in there, what's fascinating is we believe there's two stories. There's a story, Proto-Egyptian, that is 4,500 years old, of two brothers, Nessa Desheb and Nessa Teru, who came to this place. Their boat was stranded here. One went west for 2 seasons during a drought, was bitten by a snake and interred there and buried there. That's one story, and we believe that's true and it's there. We think there's an older one, much older. And I've noticed, I've got accounts of this, and I found it interesting. I've got a full map of the glyphs there, and they left the 8 UFOs off. I've read
How many?
eight different UFOs. Now, what's fascinating about those UFOs is this. Every other glyph that's reused more than once is exactly the same. The 8 UFOs, and that's not what I call them, that's what everyone calls them, because there is no other description for them but that. Everyone calls them that. And what's interesting is all 8 are different. No 2 are the same. But when I look at the glyph for revered person, there's 3 of them, exactly the same format. When I see the hand for placement, same format again. But when I look at the glyphs, they have 9 legs, 7 legs, 3 legs. Some are upside down. Some have got caps. They're all different from one another. And that, to me, has always been fascinating. Now, here's the story. They're supposed to be done by New Agers when they were supposed to be fake, but they're inside a large line, and you can see if they did those UFOs, they must have done all the other stuff as well as. I don't believe that. And then some people said they're jewellery. I've looked at the glyph for jewellery. I've looked at the glyph for gold and silver, and all of them are semicircles inverted down. These are all semicircles inverted upwards, and the semicircles inverted down have a straight line going across. These are spheres, and the legs are different. In fact, they're completely different.
So let's just get into the Egyptian thing for a minute, because from what I understand, there are 3 different stages or styles of Egyptian hieroglyph. There's the proto, which is the oldest, and then what do you call the other 2? Is it just stage 1 and 2, or A and B? Or?
They're just younger ones as they become more refined, and they're different ones, and they came after. Now, this is supposed to be Proto-Egyptian, the first form of glyph ever. So this is what this is supposed to be. And what we're seeing there, yes, it definitely is. I've got a manual right here with 3,100 that Ray Johnson used that was verified by Dr. Dia Abu Ghazi. She's the Director General of Cairo Museum, so I know I'm using the right book. Now, what's interesting in there is, yes, you've got the full story there. There are 4 cartouches there, and the one about Lord Dejeb is definitely there. And the whole story about the drought is definitely there. All that is there. But there is an older form of writing there where most of it is not in that book. And half of it doesn't make any sense. And sometimes they've taken glyphs like there's one where a bird has got 2 heads, one on top of another. They've made the second head into a neck. And you can see it's 2 heads. And they've changed it around so it just fits into something else. We think there's a much older style of glyph there. Now, when in our interviews, Arnie Bev said something I've never heard her say before, and she never spoke about Egypt. In fact, when she was interviewed once before, she wouldn't speak about it. And she told us for the first time she said, there are the Egyptian glyphs that the women would treat with their urine to keep fresh and keep so we could read it. And she said all the older hieroglyphs there are not Egyptian, they're ours. Now, I've heard this before. They did writing. And the Egyptians may well have come here and learnt the concept of writing from here, because half those glyphs, including all the UFOs and quite a few others, are not in any book.
So there's two scenarios that could be seen here. One is that the very early Egyptians came here with their Proto-Egyptian hieroglyph language, left their mark, or that if life did originate from Australia, that the first Australians who left here and went to Egypt took the proto-language with them.
Yep. Look, can I go one step further?
Yeah.
Here's a story. Yeah. It's quite true too, and it's actually Robert Bednarek, who's considered Australia's top rock art specialist. This is straight from him. there's a form of engraving called panoramity, and there's different glyphs, and they're called petroglyphs. They're called that, and they're different shapes and size. And a lady called Leslie Maynard come up with the idea that this is the beginning of all language and all writing in the world. I'm going back 40, 50,000 years. And she said, I would gladly be rid of it because she was attacked by everyone. Now, Bednarik did this experiment. What he did was he sent out to, I think it was 8 of the top rock art specialists in the world. And he sent pictures of rock art found in Europe, Africa, South America, North America, all different styles of rock art, and asked them to name it. He didn't send any Australian rock art. And they all, 98% of them, named it as panoramity rock art from Australia.
Oh,
So
really?
what I'm saying,
Okay.
yeah, so going back 40,000 years and longer, I'm saying to you that then we've got Bednarik saying, I've done this experiment, which says that either panoramity is a worldwide rock art tradition that starts in Australia, or there's no such tradition at all. That were the only 2 options they had left. What he's saying is that that form of writing starts in Australia. What we're saying is, and what Arnie Bev said, not me, I'd never heard it until 2 weeks ago, that they did more ancient form of hieroglyphs. Now, it may well be that the Egyptians had their hieroglyphs to begin with, and they put it on top of that. It may have been a coincidence. They may have taught them, but it may well be that the Aboriginal people, when the Egyptians came here, people have asked, what did they come here for? I knew they came here for spiritual reasons. Because I think in that respect, they were like apprentices learning off the masters. But did they come here to learn how to read and write? And I'm starting to think now, after looking at Bednarik's work and Arnie Bev, that it may well be the older glyphs are there. And by the way, we have found 2 other sets of glyphs there, not just on the walls, but other sets. They are much older, and they haven't been looked at yet.
So you don't. So hang on. I'm gonna get my head around that. As opposed to the first Australians leaving here and then settling Egypt and taking the Proto-Egyptian hieroglyph language with them, do you think that at a later stage they came back and learnt it?
They could have, or maybe they learned it here first, because I'm just guessing there, because I have to be very careful where we're still in the theory mode, because we still get information as we go. I'm not sure whether they learnt it when they came here or whether they already had it and then they learnt more when they came here. I can tell you one thing. When you look at those glyphs, there are so many things that aren't the same as anywhere else. A lot of it is reversed. And that's a big issue's been made of that. A lot of people said, that proves it's fake, right? And a lot of people said there's 2 different stories there. Well, there are. I've said that from the start. There are definitely 2. There's an ancient one that may go way back. And with that way back one, when we get to that, I'll explain there's one very important glyph, which I think is a clue. 2 lines, 1 line, and an important glyph. But as we stand now, we certainly can do the Egyptians for sure. We think we can go back that far without a doubt. What Bednarik is saying is that all writing starts here. What Maynard is saying that, and what Arnie Bev is saying is the same thing. Now, where the Aboriginal people got that idea from is really where we start to do theories again. We can't be sure. But we certainly can say there's a strong evidence now. If those glyphs, and don't forget, if the guy found this, National Parks and Wildlife Officer first found this in 1978, and then there was a cover-up. National Parks and Wildlife admitted. I said to him at the time, did they think it was a forgery? He said, oh, no, we all knew it was Egyptian. So that part really is a given. They all knew it was Egyptian. The problem was, as somebody said, we don't want all these people traipsing all over it, so they covered it up. There was a decision made there to make sure it was kept quiet because they didn't want this to get out. Because it
When
is
did it go public?
Look, the idea was to begin with, it was kept very quiet. In fact, I can give up some of what David's going to say because he's gone public with this and I know it's going to cause some grief. When he was taken there, he had to trade off a site he'd found to be shown this site because they're going to keep it so quiet. He wasn't allowed to show anyone. But you know as well as I do, there's half a dozen people that know about it. Somebody told someone. Mm-hmm. And by the mid-80s, it really started to get out. People were coming in all the time to look at it. And he got involved in it for a while. And then by the end of that time, soon after he got so fed up with what was going on because it became a circus, he walked away and shut up for 15, 20 years and said nothing. And he's been sitting on it until recently. And the real story was that they didn't know what to do with it. So the best idea was to begin with, they were going to destroy the site. They were going to seal the entrance. And that was what he says in the actual interview. He says that's what they tried to do.
When you say
That
they,
was,
we are talking about the National Wildlife Service here in
we
Australia.
are talking, I mean, this is what he said. I'm only saying what he said. I didn't prompt him. He approached me. And the first thing he said to me, he said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "For the truth." He said, "Right, well, then that's why we're going to do it." This is what he's prepared to say, and he's given up. He was the Parks and Wildlife Sites Officer. He wasn't look after it. He was the one who cleaned it out. No one else did, but he cleaned it out. It took him 2 trips. And he said when he cleaned it out, there the glyphs were. Some were visible, a lot weren't because they were just covered in rubbish. And he said it had been covered for decades, this stuff. So he was the guy that found it. And he took people to show it. There's a story going around at National Parks and Wildlife. Sydney Uni did it. He actually told us the truth. There's some truth in that. Sydney Uni did do it. He took some Sydney Uni students there in the 80s to it. And one of them put their fingers on it and scratched at it. And he told them to take their fingers off. So the theory going around that Sydney Uni scratched in those chisel marks or chiseled in those marks and did it in the 80s, there's a germ of truth there. They were there in the 80s and they did chisel with a fingernail. And then the rumours got around. It's a very accepted one. One of the two is that Sydney Uni did it. Well,
the original rumour that it was a hoax by a couple of New Age hippies that were students at Sydney Uni, that they got the credit for doing the whole glyph work.
Yeah, look, I have no doubt, and I've seen pictures. I can tell you now, the engraving above Sooty or Anubis, depending on who it's claimed to be, things have been added to the ears. And I've seen a couple of other things that look very suspicious, like there's something that isn't quite right there, like something's been added. I don't believe 300 were added, and I don't believe that all the other stuff that's been found with it. Because don't forget, if we just sat on the glyphs alone, in fact, at one stage when we had about 56 pieces of evidence, we ranked the glyphs 48 on the probability it was certain. And until these testimonies came up, we still ranked them low. But once we get the National Parks and Wildlife Sites Officer and we get the last darking young elder telling me they're Egyptian, I'm not arguing anymore. And by the way, what is interesting is the National Parks and Wildlife Sites Officer is also directly related to Pemulwuy. It's his great-grandfather. So there's a man that works for National Parks and Wildlife and Australian Museum collecting sites and who's linked to Pemulwuy. If he tells me that he found this in the late 70s and he cleaned it out and that is legitimate, for me, I don't have to go much further. It's a lay down misere. And then the elder, the last elder, is sitting alongside. They'd never met before. When we did the film interview, they'd never met one another. And she says Egyptian and the women looked after it. It becomes very easy. All we got to work out now is the first story about the death is done. The older story with the 8 UFOs is the really important part. And what I found was interesting about that is there is an elder that gave a story before he died, Uncle Reuben Kelly. And it's a clue because it's in the glyph. Now, Uncle Reuben is a Dunghutti man, which is not that far away from Darkinong land. And he had this story, and he said this, and I'll try and get it right word for word. And he was the last man allowed to cut boys in New South Wales. He said, "We came here in a spaceship, and when it hit the atmosphere, it exploded into crystal." It's something like that. It's very close to that. Now, that is the story. A spaceship that exploded into crystal when it came there. Now, when we looked at the 8 UFOs, they were in all different shapes and sizes, and some were quite small. And they looked like sort of like escape pods. But then there was one glyph that we found that was separate from all that. And it was probably the most important glyph of all because it's not in the book. But it's a combination of 3 glyphs that are in the book, and you can find them all on one page. And I think the numbers are 1,821 and 1,832, and the other one's on the page after. And this is what you get. The glyph is a long rectangle. Now, every ship in Proto-Egyptian starts with a rectangle, then some sort of marking above to tell us what the ship does. So we knew that was a ship. Above it are 4 dots. There is nothing there for 4 dots, but there is one with 4 dots and a little casing around it, and that means island. So we know it's a ship from an island, and next to it is south, and we're in this place, so I'm thinking island, Australia, okay, we've got a ship here. The one underneath is a really interesting one. There are 4 lines that run underneath, and there's only one glyph, and it's 1,821 line or something like that alongside it, which means crystal. Now, crystal, the glyph crystal is the 4 lines, rectangle above, and then 4 inverted V's above that to make crystal. This time we've got 4 dots, and around it we've got these spaceships. Is this the crystal spaceship that Uncle Reuben spoke about, Uncle Reuben Kelly, he spoke about in his oral mythology? And are these 8 things here, these spaceships that actually escaped from that particular spaceship? That's what we found interesting. And what we also found on the wall was one line. And I've got official transcripts, and the whole of this line has been left out of every official transcript and has been acknowledged once in Hand Dieter von Zent's paper. And it means this. He says, "O holy shining one." Now, the one for holy is definitely right. There's a glyph there for holy. Now, the one for shining, he says this is jewelry, and they put on extra lines for luminescence. Scribes don't do this. It is a UFO upside down from the way it should be, and it's got 9 arms on it, and it's a UFO. Now, what's interesting is this is the most holy of all the symbols, and the guy is sitting in a chair holding something. Next to it is a UFO. 3 back that side is another UFO, and another one back there. Again, there are 9 glyphs, and in it are 3 UFOs, and it begins with a UFO and finishes with one, and you have the most holy of all people sitting in a chair. I think that line is probably the most important line on the whole wall. And I think that tells me, when I looked at that line, I thought, if these guys aren't trying to tell me something about steering the spaceship here, I've got to be blind. I couldn't see it any other way. And it's that line, which is the holiest, probably the holiest figure on the whole thing, that's referred to in the transcriptions as Holy One. It's not shining. The Holy One is in the UFO, and there's 2 before it and 1 that finishes it. And the last one is the biggest of all the UFOs there. Now, I've got the glyphs, I've got all the other glyphs there, and I just cannot believe that that is not a story about some form of Pleiadian presence in this area.
Do they talk about whether or not the Pleiadians came here intentionally, or whether they just accidentally came here, or anything like that?
No, the elders are very specific. When they talk about Pleiadian stories, oh, God, they'll talk about this all the way along. No, very specific that was intentional, but this explosion or whatever took place in the atmosphere was not intentional.
Okay.
That was not meant to happen. You see, Arnie Bev gave us another story, and so did Graham, and we've got this one also filmed up, where they talk about a huge explosion. They talked, both Graham and Arnie Bev both spoke about this huge explosion. She was passed on by her elders, who told her about this massive explosion. And here's the sad part of the story. There was an actual account of it in Gosford. And Arnie Bev tells us about this in an interview. She says that she was supposed to look after it, and it is an account of this massive explosion with what she thinks like lava coming out everywhere. It goes through the whole of New South Wales. They all know of this explosion. And what happened was, when she was in hospital, bless them, the Department of Main Roads bulldozed the whole site and destroyed it. So it's no longer there. She was asked to look after it, and when she was in hospital, I swear to you, they must have known she was in there. This was in the 80s when virtually no one listened anyway. It's now gone. But we still have her account of the site being there, so we have her word. And by the way, if Tony Bev says it was there, I don't need any more than that anyway. It was there, but we actually have an account. What's fascinating is the engraving of it, or whatever it is that was there, was in this region again. And it sort of brings us back to this same place again.
So does the evidence and this site that she was supposed to look after, is it saying that this crash from the Pleiadians happened in the Gosford area?
Well, I'm not sure what it's saying. All I'm saying is that Graham said there was something that came from the sky. Arnie Bev wasn't sure, but it was in all the mythology through the whole of this state of New South Wales. Many tribes knew of something that took place. Some people might think it's a comet, but I don't think that's the case, because there is this story everywhere, not even in New South Wales, the whole of this country, about Pleiades. Here you've got Uncle Reuben saying that it turned to crystal and exploded when it hit the atmosphere. That fits in perfectly. Then you've got all this evidence you've got around Gosford of this sort of, and then you've got it in the cave there, I've also been offered, I'm in the process of being offered two other pieces of evidence where they've used the word UFO, but I won't go further than that now. That's come up since this to sort of match what they've been given. So I'm getting this influx now of this same evidence that's taking place. And the wall, you must understand, the UFO glyph, there are 7 to 8 of those, and the next most common glyph is revered personal majesty, and there's about 4 of those, then another 4 or 5 for God. This actually has got, the Egyptian story here is an incredibly, incredibly sacred story. I know that Paul White, who actually was one of the first person to see it and did some stories about this, he made comment about the fact that when he looked at the glyphs there, he saw references to magic and higher spiritual knowledge, and the spiritual and transient images all the way through there. And he thought there was some sort of shamanic path to enlightenment found on those walls. So I think there's something very, very important. I think Paul White was right about that. I know he walked away from the glyphs later and thought that they were actually fake, but I know now what I know, and I know that these guys have since, and I found out about Sydney Union, I found out that's not quite the case anyway, and I've spoken to the people who were on site to begin with, the very first person to find the place. That makes a difference. If that's what it is, shamanic path of enlightenment, that fits with for me, and that's what he sensed, and that's what we sense now. And I must tell you, the most common glyphs throughout are always esoteric ones, death. And what's interesting too, when we look at that, a lot of them are reversed.
So you mentioned that before. Do you think that's a northern southern hemisphere situation, or?
No. As you know, Lisa, I'm working with a large group of people, always giving information and giving stuff in there.
Mm-hmm.
One of the people I was working with, who is a great devotee of Thoth and the Book of Hermes, reads it all the time, when she found out it was being reversed, and there's been a big issue about that, and Paul took that in and thought, oh my God, they've done the transcript back to front. In that region, in this specific region, we have found mergings of Thoth and Duramulin, who was the son of Biami, as an ibis person, as an ape man. We've seen Duramulin's, the Ankh, which is false accompaniment engraved into rock. We found this all around in this region. And then we found one particular clue, which is really important, which tells us why a lot of the stuff on that wall has been reversed. 2 kilometres away, there's an engraving called Bulgandri. It's a very famous engraving. There's a big walk around there and you get to see it. Now, we know it's Egyptian. Only Minnie Mace told me it's Egyptian. I knew that to begin with, so that was a good clue. When you go and look at it, it's got a huge headdress, it's a male, and he's got a broadsword, and it looks exactly like a broadsword, which is about 5 foot long, going across the centre there, and a boat which goes for 9 metres underneath there. That's the boat he came from. That's the Egyptian broadsword. That's his headdress. All that's fine. But remember this, in one hand he holds the sun, and the other he holds the moon. Now, this lady sent across this quote, and it comes from the Book of Hermes. I'm going to read 3 lines in a row, and I want you to think about Bulgandri when I read these lines, and you'll see how this works. Indeed, it says this, indeed, the appearance of sun and moon are omniform, rather like our mirrors that produce likeness through reflection in brilliance. The importance of this is a mirror reflection and the duality of the seasons. I've already told of the mirror reflection of the moon. Now, if Bulgandri is Thoth, and I'm not the first person who said he is, and I think
Bulgandri is the indigenous name here for the same character, you believe?
Yes, and we've got engravings there of Thoth, with the top of Thoth and the bottom of Bulgandri with 1 club foot and 1 long leg, which is how you do that's how you do Duramulin. This one also, this Bulgandri has 1 club foot and 1 leg longer than the other, just like Duramulin, but he's balancing the sun and the moon like Thoth did again. The other engravings we've got where you've got Duramulin's feet. I've got an ibis in profile form. Aboriginal people don't do profile, Egyptians do. I've got the ape in profile form with 1 eye. Again, Aboriginal people do too. So we've got the mixture all the way through. Bulgandri is giving us a clue. Now, Bulgandri is 2 kilometres away from the glyphs, and he points directly towards the glyphs. He said mirror reversal. Now, yes, a lot of these are mirror reversed. All the important cartouches are reversed, so the birds are facing the wrong way. The cartouche for death, the head is on the wrong side. All the sacred stuff has been mirror reversed because that's the way Thoth writes his wisdom, as a mirror. If you held them up the right way around and put a mirror against them, they're the right way around. Now, what I'm saying is, now Paul thought, oh, it's all mirror reversed. It's not. Some is, some isn't. You will see the Sphinx, very important, it's the right way around. You'd think that would be one that's going to know that one is the right way. You'll see hands pointing the right way. You'll see some birds pointing the right way, but the birds in the cartouche are pointing the opposite way, the wrong way around. So what I'm suggesting is, yes, there's a sacred message there, and the clues are in. Look around the ones that have been reversed. And you look around the ones reversed, like the flag for God, and then you'll see death marked out there. That's reversed. That section around there's got a special message that comes from way back. Look, so what I'm suggesting is that what we've got with Borgandri alongside is with the sun in one hand, moon in the other, is pointing towards the glyphs. What people have looked at the glyphs, they've forgotten to put Borgandri as part of this. It's the most important engraving they've got in the whole region. It's up in New Miners Shopping Centre. It's the first part of their history line. They forgot to look as it's part of something else. Now, all this stuff around there is part of that same story. What we also found is you go directly above the glyphs, and this has already been dated. You'll find there's 14 sun discs up there which mark out the stars 4,500 years ago. Proto-Egyptian is 4,500 years old.
So marking the time when the Egyptians came here.
Yep. So when Lord Djed came here, the Aboriginals, because Egyptians do stars with actually like a star with 5 arms. These are sun discs done by the Aboriginals. They've done one above to mark when they come here to validate the fact they're actually here. The proof for me about this being the Egyptian part is really such an easy one now. It really is done and dusted. The part I'm fascinated with now is this Pleiades story, these 8 UFOs. I don't believe they were done by New Agers, as everyone says. I don't believe they were done by anyone else but the people who did them. And I think they all mean something. And I think what's interesting with them is I think each of them, and there is a story there. It's a myth, I believe. I'm not sure. Maybe it's true. I've heard this story often, that there were 8 or 9 escape craft that came down and one landed upside down. What's interesting is on those walls is one of the UFOs is actually upside down. Yeah. So, you start to wonder about that. Because, as I said, this is what Paul said, it's a sacred place. It may well be a testimony by the Pleiadians and a story of why they came here. Don't know.
So what are they saying about what this year means? They say it's a special year. They say this is the year. The year for what? For the year for what?
The year for change. The year for change. They won't say how. I've heard all sorts of stories. I will tell you one I have heard. I think it's okay to spread this one because I've said it before. Some I won't say because I was asked not to. I've been told about what it'll be like after, but I've been told not to say that. I can say one thing. I was told, and we have this on email, that there'd be an earthquake on the 23rd of March near Uluru.
I've told this story too. I've told it many times, yeah.
We were told that was going to happen. We were told it was a 9-month gestation period, which is December the 23rd, and I'm aware of the link there, and I've been pointed out to me. I've been told of the rumbling everywhere, and there's been so many earthquakes that have taken place in Australia since then. They're nearly common. We never used to have that before. I believe that the dust storm that came from the lizard, all these things that are happening now are part of that. There's going to be a cleansing of some form. I don't know what it's going to be, but they do tell me end of the year. So all I can guess is that at the end of this year, something's going to take place, and I believe there's some elders who know. They'll know more, and maybe we'll find out a bit more, maybe we won't. But I think I have no doubt that the reason they're giving up this stuff and the stuff that we're being shown and the stuff we're about to be shown, actually, always, every time they said to me, they're doing it because it's this year. If it had been 2 years ago and I've walked along here, I would have nothing. Honestly, it's only been this year.
So isn't there talk of the return of the Palladians, though?
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I'm not going to – I'm having enough trouble talking about UFOs. I'm going to say that, right? I'm doing it, yeah, and I've got it on print and I've actually said it on the film. I had to. I am not going to go that far down the line, but I'm going to say that, yes, they do say that. You've got to remember, it's walking in a minefield, academic minefield, walking down here.
I get that.
Yeah,
I get that you've got that whole academic side to what you're doing, and that they're the ones you're kind of going up against. But
yeah,
just bringing it down to what the Indigenous are saying about what's to come and what you're allowed to share about that. From what I understand, they are saying that this is the time of the return of the Palladians and to the return of the old ways, which
yep,
to me is the Palladian way of life. And there's talk from other cultures too about a return to the old ways, and I think a lot of people are misinterpreting that to we're going to be thrown back into the Stone Age. Um, that's not my interpretation of a return to the old ways. I think it's a return to an understanding of who we really are and the powers that we really have. Um, and I've heard lots of stories about Indigenous people, who seem to be able to be in more than one place at a time, disappear from one place and reappear
yeah,
in other places, um, communicate telepathically, pop up in the middle of the desert,
yeah.
that sort of thing.
That's what you got it
That's my
right.
return to the old ways.
Look, you've got it perfect, and a lot of people use that smoke screen as saying, "Oh, look, we can't wander around with our clothes and just pick up nuts and berries." No one's saying that. Nobody has, and nobody is saying that. Never did. You've got that exactly right. It's a way of living, a way of understanding, and a purpose. Why we're here, and giving us a purpose and a reason for existence, and what our function is. And that's what they do all say that they expect. You've got to remember. I know that there's going to be another one of the films that's going to be done. I know that the grandmother is going to say that they point to Pleiades like that's where we come from. They say this. They look upon. They don't even think, as much as I'm going to be hesitant about how I put this, they don't actually say that the Pleiadians are going to come back as per se as if like it's some sort of strange UFO group. It's like their long lost sisters and brothers who live a long way away will come back and make contact again. It's that simple for them.
It's
They
a
don't
family
see it.
reunion.
Yeah, they don't see it like ET and extraterrestrials with long fingers and big necks and greys. No, they just see them like people just like themselves. That's how they'll see them. They're going to come back and reconnect something that was always there. So yeah, they do talk about that all the time. And what I'm trying to do is, as much as I can, because we're trying to see if we can get a line where we don't scare people away too much. But I was always warned that I would go down that path. So I've got no issue with it. I'm trying to let the moment hedge it by saying 95 to 99% to give me an out. And also it makes it more palatable for the academics to listen to the rest of it. If you say I'm nearly convinced, because it means they don't get scared as much. But I can tell you there's one line on that wall there, and we do highlight that wall. You've just got to sit and look at that particular line and then try and convince yourself, if it's legitimate, what else would it be other than some sort of message from another group of people or beings that aren't basically from here? There's just no other way it can be read. It's so simple and easy to read. And what I'm starting to think is if the Aboriginal people had their own form of writing, and I'm seeing that in the Flinders Ranges. I spoke to someone talking about the same years, around 40,000 there. I'm seeing it all over. And I saw it in that cave of the emu prints. I guarantee you there's nearly 200 emu prints there, and no two are the same. No two are the same. They're all in different, and they all mean something. Imagine the intellect involved in memorising those stories and knowing what all those emu prints meant. We couldn't do it today. We can't even remember the third line of our Advanced Australia Fair, let alone do that. So that would be impossible. But that's the sort of, they had forms of writing there now that I don't think we even get or even understand. And now I've got the elders saying, yeah, we wrote before them. We know they did astronomy before them. And I think you're going to find that this fixation with communication and astronomy, I think this has come from their brothers and sisters from afar. That's why everywhere, above the Gosford Glyphs, we know there are going to be hundreds. We did a 300 metre section above the glyphs and found 62 astronomical markers. And we've got kilometres to do yet. There will be hundreds. And I know there are other places around that have got even more we're going to be shown. So you've got to wonder why people are so obsessed by the stars unless it's part of their life.
Mm. What do you think, based on everything you've learned, what have you come away? What have you come away thinking for yourself to expect for the rest of this year or and beyond?
Well, I'm starting to work out, I'm getting a better feel for where our culture comes from now. I'm starting to think something else that I never thought before. I have actually called that area I'm working on, that Sydney Gosford region, the Alexandria of the Stone Age. And I believe the Egyptians got the idea of Alexandria from there. And I'd assume, because you'll find there Wandjina paintings, Wandjina art, you'll find Mimi art, you'll find Bradshaw art, you'll find best form of Bradshaw art I've ever seen in my life.
What do those names mean?
They're regional styles of art that are only found in one part of Australia, but you'll find them in Gosford. You'll find all the styles of art that I thought were found only in one region and would only belong in that region. I find them in Gosford, and I keep thinking, what are the Lightning Brothers doing here? They shouldn't be here. They should be in the middle where they belong. And I had thought that that was because the different custodians were bringing that information into Gosford, giving the songs, because the songs and ceremonies can only be put there with that actually engraving in rock. It's got to be put together. And I thought that they brought them in there and used this place as sort of like a repository where we find the Stonehenge arrangements and all that sort of stuff. But I'm now starting to wonder whether it all began there first. The Bradshaw art that we see, the dot art that you people know as Papunya art, which I've also seen there, the Panoramity art, which we've seen there, did it all begin there and then get sent to those places? And did different people go out from that area as this area got bigger? And they've got a dreaming story there about this whole Gosford area becoming so overpopulated, people moved out. Did each of them take that style with them? And was that the beginning point? And does that mean that maybe when these UFO, the people from Pleiades come here, was there, dare I say it, and there is evidence of this on the wall, was there evidence of some form of genetic involvement here? Because I've also got that on the walls I've seen too. And that's another part that makes me wonder a bit more.
So hang on, you're going to have to back up a bit there. So hang on, the hypothesis we've got at the moment is that we've got a UFO, giant UFO from the Pleiades, intentionally coming to Earth, reaches our atmosphere, becomes crystalline. They shoot out 8 escape pods. They all land in the Gosford area.
Mm-hmm.
From there, perhaps they breed with or genetically manipulate whatever life form they found already occupying the area.
Well, you've got these stories in Sumerian religions. You've got them all over the place. You've got this mythology taking place there. Now, the reason why we think this, and again, I'm only consulting the walls. I'm trying to look at these walls open-ended without anything else. Mm. Is there's some glyphs on the walls that don't make sense again. Now, the one that I'm thinking of particularly, and I've seen this more than once, I've seen the sign for chemical symbol on that wall. 3 dots in a row. 1, 2, 3 means chemical symbol. And I've seen it a couple of times. Now, once it's just there on its own. On other occasions, I see the 3 on top of one another with 2 legs underneath. And then I've seen the 3 on top of one or 2 legs and then wings coming out the other side. And what I've also seen there is another one which looks very indiscreet and it doesn't look that important. It's just a stick man, face like that with just a stick. But here's the point, it's facing me. And no glyph has humans facing. They're always sideways and never as a stick man. Now, I'm wondering about these constructs, the simplest form of man I'm seeing there. Then I'm seeing 3 chemicals which are normally separate. They go across this way. Now they're horizontal and stacked on one on top of another, and they've got these legs sticking out. And I've got different constructs like that. Then I've got this amazing bird with 2 heads. And I'm thinking, what is this telling me? And I'm just looking at what I see there, and I'm thinking that doesn't seem to rub together. And none of these, by the way, you will find in any of the books. So these are another signs that don't get in the popular accounts I've seen in Nexus and others. These ones aren't drawn in either. And as I said, the 2-headed bird is drawn differently. So I'm wondering, I've got creators in there. I've got majesty in there. I've got these ships here, and then I've got these strange chemical symbols there. And again, it's not my theory. I'm just looking at what's there, and I'm wondering what that means. And what I've also got there is I've got three glyphs there that mean ancient city. Now, who put that in? Three different glyphs that mean that. Now, and it's interesting because there's nothing exactly the same in the book there, but all three of them, one has been misconstrued as Land's End.
So the book you're referring to is a book of all known Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Proto-Egyptian. This is the one that Ray Johnson used, and I'm using Ray Johnson's interpretation. He did this in the 1990s, and he went across.
Just proto.
Proto-Egyptian, yeah. And we know that there's a lot of Proto-Egyptian there, and then there's a lot of stuff that doesn't fit in there because it seems this is the stuff I think that Arnie Bev's talking about, the older stuff that I think could have been given to them by the people who landed or the Aboriginal people, but certainly not Egyptians. This is much older, and this stuff doesn't fit in. And what's interesting, I've always found the beginning of the description, which I think is right. I think Ray's got most of this right, and I use his because he went and saw the Director General of the Cairo Museum, and she authenticated his transcription. So I go with the Director General of the Cairo Museum as opposed to anyone in Australia. But it begins like this: we are stranded in this wretched land. I always had a problem with this because when Cook got stranded at Cooktown, they landed, cut down some trees and put some planks of wood back on there and sailed off again. If these Egyptians had sailed from Egypt to Australia and they're stranded and their boats were tied up and they went 2 seasons west, which means they didn't go and look after their boats, I'm wondering, are they stranded? If it's a boat that's stranded, cut down a tree, and if you've done all those engravings and the rocks there, you can certainly cut down a tree and shape it up. Secondly, what I found interesting is this. If it's a wretched land and they're deliberately sailing to Australia and they land at Gosford, I'm going to tell you now, you did pretty damn well. You could have got a lot worse place than Gosford to land there because you've got temperate rainforest there, you've got all this water, you've got fresh water coming in, you've got mangrove there, you've got all different types of ecosystems there. It's a great place to be stranded. If you're in a spaceship that's blown up and your escape pods have landed in the Earth, you can't get back to Pleiades, you would then be stranded in this wretched land that you didn't expect to be placed in. If you're an Egyptian that sailed from Egypt to Australia, yes, you've been marooned, cut down a tree for God's sake, fix the boat up and sail back. But no, they say they're stranded in this wretched land. And from that point of view, even before we even spoke of the UFOs and before I even thought about that, never ran right to start a story. And that part's always been an issue for me. And now, when I'm starting to look at this in more detail, the part they called Land's End. Yes, well, it could be, except for the fact that the one they picked for Land's End is just a cross. This one's got a complete circle going around. It's been chiseled in. If you move that chisel around a little bit, it means ancient ruins again. Did the Egyptians, when they get there, were they aware of the fact there were more ancient civilization that was there? And that's why there are 3 glyphs there, 3 different glyphs that mean ancient city or ancient ruins. So I'm wondering whether there's actually a story there. There's 3 stories there, one about him being stranded. And you've got to remember in this stranded story, there is a whole section in the accounts that Ray gave and Hans Dieter gave where all of a sudden the brothers aren't mentioned. It just goes on about esoteric stuff. Then all of a sudden the brothers turn up again. There's a whole wad of this where there's no mention of the death. And I'm thinking that's part of that story. So I think there are 2, maybe 3 stories there, maybe even more at different times. And there is another glyph there that reinforces the genetic engineering. And that's the most obvious one, and it's kept separate from every other glyph. And there you've got one person, a tall alien-type figure, and then attached 2 things coming out of the stomach, and then there's a second person, a smaller person, and in it is a scepter, which is called the scepter of life. And I'm wondering if he's making that person there. So when you look at that, when you look at those walls now, knowing they are legitimate, they were there and then dug out in the late 70s, and that one person lied and another group are telling the truth, and you look at all this other stuff that's never been understood, that's what we should be looking at. And you've got to remember too with hieroglyphs, hieroglyphs can have 6 different meanings. So when you take 3 out and you say that's what that one means, that's very dangerous. You could have got the meanings wrong. And I found a lot of these have a lot of different meanings that could mean something completely different. And I think because they've taken so many out, you're not sure.
So how is the academic world relating to all of this?
Oh, not well, I can assure you.
Yeah.
Not well. No, actually, I don't think it's going to go down that well because it. Look, there's been a universal in Australia. Everyone's dismissed the glyphs. They've all decided it's fake because it doesn't fit. There's virtually nobody that validates them, and nobody that wants to say. In fact, National Parks and Wildlife claim they were made in 1987, 1988. If you check their records, and the shaft, the 30-foot shaft that runs directly underneath it, was chiselled out. They claim that was done in 1990 something. We still haven't found all the stuff that was chiselled out. But no, they won't accept it at all. They haven't for quite some time. There's been an official embargo placed on it. And really, we approach those glyphs rather reluctantly, knowing that once we touch them, the great majority of people will not go near us. In fact, we've already got probably 2 people we're working with that have now walked away from us. We had
Because they're sticking with the glyphs are fake theory.
Very upset, very upset with the fact that I actually chose not to back Alan Dash. Oh, well, he's the guy that put out the fact that he saw it in the 70s. And my point was this, that I'd sat in front and knew these people, these 2 people had said the opposite. I've never met Alan Dash. I don't know him. I know nothing of him, but I know these other people. They're both elders. They're both Aboriginal. This guy isn't. I don't have an option here. I go with where the blackfellas tell me. They told me this is true. So that has caused a big issue. And now there's been no more correspondence between us. And I know I've been told by another person who also got involved in this how disappointed he is that I even go back and do the glyphs. And I wasn't going to do them. But they are legitimate. So what do you do? If people tell you the truth, you've got to follow that. So it's going to be a problem. And that's why we're putting this out on YouTube. We're not going to put it out through mainstream because I'm not even sure we'll get it out. And that's we're going through organisations and groups like yourself, Lisa, that are prepared to actually let the truth get out, and we'll do it through the mainstream. We won't do it through the mainstream. We'll just go through YouTube, and we'll do it that way, and we'll let the truth get out through the way it should.
I mean, this is some of the most exciting information I've heard in a long time for me. And this, for me, this part of what this whole 2012 paradigm is all about. It's, it's truth time. And I've learned to become so cynical about what we are officially told that when they say look left, I automatically look right these days. And also, because they've been so quiet, the Indigenous people of this country have been so quiet in terms of what this time is all about and what to expect. Now that they're finally talking, I mean, I just find that really, really exciting. And I have heard one story that one of them has commented that when all the satellites fall from the sky, that's when you'll take notice. Something along those lines. I know I'm paraphrasing. So they do foresee some interruptions to our day-to-day life.
Oh, definitely do. Yeah, they do.
Did they talk to you at all about natural, like you said, we've had lots of earthquakes. I've got a black fella who tells me every time he comes over that, where I live, I've got this huge escarpment mountain behind us.
Mm.
And he says, when the wave comes, it's going up over there. So,
yeah, look, they do talk about, Lisa. Yeah, look, they talk about the sun. They talk about a big surge of energy from the sun, and we know they've mapped the sun. We know that up at Gosford they've mapped plasma events before from the sun. They talk about that. And I know that we've had plasma events before that would take out every satellite, knock them all out. They talk about that. They do talk about the waves. They talk about all these things because I think it's fair to say it's not going to be, and I don't believe none of them have spoken about the 2012 Hollywood epic where the wave goes above the Himalayas with the bell ringing. It's not like that. But I do think there is going to be a cleansing, and I think there's going to be a lot of cleansing that's going to take place, and there will be inconveniences. They talk about that also. But I think it's also really important from the Indigenous, and I'm not talking about overseas, I'll stick solely with what the mob around here are talking about. They talk about the change that's going to come out of it, but they don't see it. The ones that know don't see this as something that's going to be feared, but something to really look forward to, and as something that we should all look forward to as a salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said before, I've sat with old people that's spoken about the fact that, oh yeah, I was knocked the totem over and then I appeared 150 k's away, and there were about 15 people in the room. That ought to be the conversation we all should be going through. You know, I mean, I've sat with some people there and I've told people it's like it was, okay, there was a caravan park there, but I swear it was 300 years ago. And that I watched the conversation that spent an hour about a flock of black cockatoos landing and what it meant. That was the conversation. There was nothing else that was based around anything other than that. That's what they're offering. They're offering stuff like that we really should be doing. And so there, from their point of view, they just think they count the days down.
I
They
was
think,
talking to a gentleman the other day who told me a story of 20 years ago, picking up a hitchhiker up in Queensland, and really grubby old guy. He said, but when he got in the car, turned out to be an elder, and they got talking. And he invited my friend back to his house. He said, how about you drive me home and you can come and stay? And he ended up staying there for a month or 6 weeks. And he witnessed with his own eyes them turning into kangaroos.
yeah,
And they taught him how to do it. And he said that when he got to the point where he saw his hands start to turn into paws, he completely freaked out and backed up. All these things went through his mind of, what if I can't get back? And, how do I tell my son what I am now? And it stopped the process. But, and there was a whole group of them. There was a whole mob of them that did it, not just one individual.
You know, it's interesting what you just said, Lisa. It reminded me of something a couple of days ago. I've got a link with someone through SBS, and they're going to pick up our YouTube and send it through to SBS. And he was saying, I've got to get a statement off another part of National Parks and Wildlife to verify what this person said. And then he said something I think is really sad. I said, yeah, but I got the statement from the elder about the fact that it's Egyptian. They washed it with the women's urine and stuff like that. So that won't count. That won't count. And I'm thinking that's what's really wrong with this whole story at the moment, that I've got the statement of the last darking young elder that's got a blood link that can talk about she was sitting on the shoulders of these elders or down at the beach there. That doesn't count. The fact that I've got a National Parks and Wildlife officer, just somebody who works for National Parks and Wildlife, that counts heaps. And I'm thinking that is what the change is going to be. The change has got to be that when these elders, and they're meeting in the desert, as you know now, they're meeting in groups now, big groups, they're meeting all the time, they're talking about the change that's coming. When I say I've got the statement of this elder that's held out, now this woman, I've known her for 2 years and she's not mentioned word Egypt and Gosford Glyphs. She said, I don't even want to talk about it. She finally decides after 2 years, I'm going to give that up. That should count for heaps. It really should count more than anything else. The National Parks and Wildlife Officer should come second.
Absolutely.
And the fact is, yeah, but now we find out he's Pemulwuy sort of blood kin, well, then that means it's equal first again. But only because of that, it really should be. But it's interesting from that point of view. Oh, well, you've got the statement of an elder saying this. Well, yeah, that doesn't, we really can't. Well, we could put that on as well as we've got something else. And it shows you.
Because this guy's got a piece of paper that says...
Yeah, well, he's got a job that says he's... Now, when you say he's an ex-National Parks and Wildlife Sites officer, I know people are going to say, oh, that counts. If I said she's the last elder, well, yeah, okay, so what? Who cares about that? It should count equally, probably more so the other way, but it doesn't. That's the problem we've got. And like you said, I go around and tell people, if I go out and get up, do a big talk and talk about the fact that this bloke was at 2 places at once or turning into a kangaroo, stuff like that, that won't count. They'll all say, that's rubbish, I'm not going to listen to that. That's the problem. That is the problem. We should be listening to that, because what you said about that friend seeing that, he definitely saw it, didn't he?
Oh, I know he did. Yeah.
Yeah, if you called him a liar, he would get upset, wouldn't he?
No, I have no doubt.
Yeah. And he's got no doubt too. Well, that should actually be part of our folklore. That should be part of what our kids should be taught in the
Well,
schools, you
to me,
see.
that's the old ways that we're returning to. It's that knowledge of how to do exactly that.
That's what we're returning to. That's what we could all do. One day we might all experience the drama of, my God, my hand's turning kangaroo. What will I do next? Will I go back and become human or let it run? And
It
with a
should
bit
be
more.
taught in, yeah, like you said, taught in preschool. Okay, kids, today we're going to turn into kangaroos.
We'll do it. All right, now just sit and meditate. We'll bring an elder in now and it'll start you up.
Yeah.
Now, that could be a different education system. I bet we'll get a better response with the kids in the classroom too, eh?
That's a school I could send my kids to quite proudly. Yes.
Well, that's it. So I think that's what you're talking about now. Those sort of things, not walking around looking for witchetty grubs and eating them raw. That's not what we're talking about. And that's not what they're talking about either. But they are talking about what you just mentioned about your friend. He spent 6 weeks, and look what he gets shown in 6 weeks. That's pretty good, isn't it?
Hmm.
It's not bad, actually. So it goes to show you that he deserved what he got.
Yeah. Well, they'd sort of had a. The old boy just looked at him, I think, when he got in the car and went, "Mm-hmm, you'll do."
Yeah,
You know.
yeah,
So one thing that we did skip over back when we were talking about the history of Australia was that you've also come across a lot of evidence that it was more than just the Egyptians here,
oh yeah,
and that the Indigenous here had treaties with
yeah.
many countries, and that we still have a kangaroo skin treaty with Spain floating around.
Yeah, look, there's more to this story than I have to be careful where I go with this because one's a work in motion, and I've now been through about quite a few meetings. So I'll talk about this more in a general term than a specific term, but I'll talk about other parts. Things I do know of, there's a real issue, and I know this is an issue that brings, and I know there's quite a few people dealing with the sovereignty issue, people like Mark McMurtry, and I know Michael Anderson, and others are doing that, and they know a lot more about this than what I do, and I'm not going to go down their path because that's their skill and they know this back to front. But there is a truth. There was one treaty signed with John Batman and the people down in Victoria, which was torn up and wasn't recognised. There's been no treaty signed in Australia with the British, but there have been treaties and agreements signed with others. We do know that the Spanish have a treaty. That's been spoken of. I can speak about that in general terms because it's common all around this place, so I don't mind saying that. And it is in skin form, and it was signed. No different than Cook raising the flag on behalf of King George. There is absolutely no different. These captains were acting on behalf of the King of Spain. There was an agreement called international law, and the Spanish and the Portuguese basically had most of Australia. The sort of English came late to the piece. We know the Phoenicians were here. We know the Chinese were here. Strangely enough, I didn't know this until quite recently. I didn't know the Vikings were here, but there's a very, very good story about a wreck with that. I think you're going to find, as one elder put it to me, that Sydney and Gosford Harbour and also Kangaroo Island were major ports that lots of other people came and sailed to. The Indians have been here en masse for a long period of time. And we also know that the Egyptians were here for at least 4,000 years, continually. There were settlement agreements everywhere. It is quite possible the bottom of that engraving that I said could be genetic engineering. I've said it's one or two things. The second one is it could be Akhenaten, and that scepter could be an actual formal treaty that's taken place. And it's quite possible that's what it actually is. And we need to look at that in more detail because Akhenaten was the only pharaoh that was shown with a pot belly, and this one is shown with a pot belly. And it's worth bearing in mind that Tutankhamun's tomb is full of Australian gold and about 13 boomerangs, and I've seen them, all different shapes, sizes. So it's quite possible we have evidence of a concord between the Egyptians and the Aboriginal people at Gosford, at the Gosford Glyphs also. So we know that there were concords. We also know, I have heard of evidence of cuneiform Sumerian writing on a tablet on top of a scarab beetle, which is unusual because the Egyptians and the Sumerians didn't get on, also in this country that's been here for thousands of years. So you may well find that we've got 5, maybe 6 different groups that came here and had formal treaties and agreements. I have no doubt There was a formal treaty and agreement between the Egyptians and the Australians. I have no doubt there's one between the Spanish, and that we will be seeing fairly soon.
So
We all
the evidence is there that other cultures came here and in a cooperative sense,
yeah,
peaceful sense, came
more.
here until the British turned up.
I'll tell you what the difference is. I can tell you this as a fact. We're working on a site up here, which I've seen before. Isabel McBride saw and gave permission for me to carry on. It's unlike any other site in Australia. She didn't see the Egyptian pyramid, which I saw alongside it. And I know it was used for rites of passage by the last fully initiated, full descent Aboriginal person, Lyle Roberts. And he used it to take his boys up there for rites of passage, and they danced on something that was made, and it's not made by Aboriginals, it's made by Egyptians. I have no doubt that for him to carry on that ceremony on what was made by Egyptians means that the Egyptians and Aboriginal people were sharing more than gold. I think they were sharing esoteric wisdom of the highest order. I think the Egyptians came here to learn the things that they wanted to know, like you said before, walking through trees, turning into other animals, telepathically communicating, being in two places at once. These were skills that were commonplace here. This is what they came to learn. They knew about this. They'd sensed it. They touched it. They'd had an entree, but they knew the main course was in Australia. And they came here to do this for quite some time, simply because they knew this was the place where this wisdom was. So I have no doubt they were here, and I have no doubt that they were allowed to share in that wisdom. And I know that they carried on ceremony up our way. And look, right above the Gosford glyphs, there we've got the Aboriginal people in carving right next to those carvings. That's another affirmation that it's okay that these guys are getting on with one another. And they've commemorated when they came by marking out the time. There is a cooperation here. And, you know, as people have pointed out to me, and it's why I've lost one film crew when they ran away when they saw this. They said, my God, this has massive legal ramifications in relation to the Constitution, in relation to Mark McMurtry and Michael Anson talking about sovereignty, because they're bloody right. We've got no right to claim sovereignty here. The Egyptians have more right, and they've got none either, but they've got more right than what we have. At least the Egyptians had a concord and agreement. We know they did because they were allowed to carve here. And I think that glyph down the bottom probably is Akhenaten and an agreement, the concord. We've got it up our way too. We know they're allowed to be there. We know the Gympie Pyramid. Why does DMR going to bulldoze it and will bulldoze it? Because it's more evidence of the Egyptians being here. They're all over the place. Remember, Lisa, take away the Gosford glyphs and we still are up to 61 pieces of evidence that prove the Egyptians were here. If I'm wrong on that one, I only have to get one of the other 61 right to prove my point. So we've got a lot more than just that one particular area.
But even the Spanish, I mean, this kangaroo skin treaty still exists, and I've been told there's a copy of it existing in Spain. The question here comes, for me, when the English came here and claimed this place, what do you think have you come up with a theory as to why the Spanish didn't go, hang on, we've got a treaty with this place, you can't do that? Something.
It's tricky because the Spanish, you've got to remember, I do know the Portuguese up our way were banished. I know, I've been told by an elder that knows his stuff, that the Egyptians were kicked out of this country 400 years ago at Balmoral, and he explained why they were kicked out and the route they were taken when they were chased out of the country. So here's the point. All of these countries have got a use-by date where they break the law and they are asked to leave. Only the British refused to go. Even the French were attacked. One of their 3 boats was taken in war at La Perouse and 500 rocks were thrown. They've all been attacked. So we don't know how the Spanish left. I can tell you they've misbehaved in other countries around the same time, 1500, 1400. So maybe they misbehaved here, but maybe they didn't.
So they've all come here and had an accord, had an agreement, had a treaty, whatever you want to call it. But at some point down the line, they're told to get out.
Maybe not. I don't know that part because I haven't heard that part of the story. And maybe I think That I will find that out. That's part of what I'm going to be given next. I will find out why they left. And maybe I'll be given more story about the Egyptians. I believe those sort of things will be covered. I've got to be circumspect about that because it's a work in motion. But I'll probably find out that part for sure, because this mob up here know the Spanish back to front of all groups. So they'll know their full story up here. So I'll be able to complete that story. But hopefully I'll have that soon. But I'm not rushing that, because that's a lot of people have to be checked first before that's okay.
So most of the evidence about the Spanish presence is in northern New South Wales. Most of the evidence for Egyptian is in the Sydney region, Gosford region. Is that what you're saying?
And also Kangaroo Island, there's Egyptian evidence there. And there is some Egyptian evidence up here also. Mm-hmm. And there is some Spanish evidence that actually Lawrence Hargraves and Norman Lindsay wrote about in their diaries, what they discovered of two boats that got stranded in Sydney Harbour. And that was 1521. And those two boats were actually from the top end there. And there's actually a story about them being lost. And they never knew where they ended up. And I think they got stranded there. But that's a different one. Up at where we are, there was a concord and agreement. Stranding is different, and leaving your mark and saying we're stuck here is different to actually having full-time agreement where they've got rights of passage and the right to stay on country. Now, that's where the British have got a real problem here with this history, because this history is showing up that they actually don't have a right to stay here to this day, and that other countries have already formally acknowledged them being here. Now, that means that up until 1988, terra nullius, which is claimed because they weren't worthy. Well, they were worthy because they had concords with people before, which means the time they came here, when they made up a fourth rule, and believe me, there was no such rule as terra nullius, they made this up. And they said they're unworthy, therefore we can take the place. Well, if it turns out the Egyptians, the Spanish, the Phoenicians have all signed concords and agreements, they were worthy legally, and that means that the whole of that claim is false, which means that...
Well, terra nullius is supposed to mean that the land is completely unoccupied, isn't it?
What it actually is, it's a catch cry. There were three ways, and the British signed up in international law. You could take it by conquest, through a treaty. You could take it because there was no one there, or you could take it through agreement. Well, they didn't get agreement. So they made up a fourth rule, that these people were here, but legally, because they did not farm the land, because they didn't fence the land, and they didn't do the things that we recognise as civilisations, they lost it. They forfeited rights because they didn't do the things that we did. And therefore, squatters who come along, if they farm the land after 7 years, they get to keep the land. The Buffalo didn't do that, therefore he doesn't deserve to own it. And that was their pretext. But the point is, they knew when they got here, they knew that this place was here to begin with. And they knew there were people here. They wrote that in their accounts. And they also knew the Spanish, the Portuguese, and all the others knew about the place too, and the Dutch. They'd all known it was here. And the Dutch,
as far as I know, Cook was guided here by maps from the French, who told him all about the place.
Well, La Perouse was only a couple of days. It turned up. La Perouse was only a few days after Philip. They were racing there to get there together, and La Perouse was actually in war, and that's why he fled. He fled the day after he was attacked by the Aboriginals on that side. And there's an account by a guy called Clinton Newton, who said that they behaved untoward towards some of the women. I think we can read between the lines there, and the whole mass of them. And then, of course, we never got the full story because La Perouse's journey, they all died on the way home. But I suspect they were going to stay there. I reckon they landed on the other side to stay, and they'd been there for a long time. It was 3 boats, as opposed to 11, which they couldn't get rid of, but they could get rid of the 3, and they did. So I suspect the French were going to stay, and I suspect they had no intentions of accepting the British claim to that because they knew it was false. That's why the French were there, because they knew that the Spanish had been there, and they knew it was a bit like Antarctica. Let's all have a go and see who claims what. So I suspect the French knew, and also it's worth bearing in mind, I got this from David Fitzgerald. If you go to, this is what David told me, he's the guy, the sites officer. If you go to Philip's account, on the 4th day, before La Perouse, or the 3rd day, the Aurora was singing French sea shanties to Philip, word perfect, with the inflections done perfectly. So, yeah, who was there before them? Everyone was there before them. There's only one difference. The others came in groups of 2 or 3 boats, or 4 boats, but they didn't come in 11 or 12. And don't forget what the British brought. They brought convicts and they brought an army. and they had an army of guns, and they were the only group they couldn't get rid of. They nearly did. Pemulwuy nearly got rid of them in 1796, but they got rid of every other group. So this was a formed group, and these guys were fighting, and that's why, because the Egyptians and the Spanish were here, we have a real issue in the Constitution, and I believe that's why the government is trying to write the Aboriginal people into the Constitution now, because they know legally they're on really dodgy ground. And they know McMurtry and Anderson and others know they're on dodgy ground.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to write them into the Constitution to say, oh, look, we're finally caring about the black fella.
No. It's to screw them again.
Again, because they know that they've got some real legal clout here on all grounds, not only just our grounds, but on legal grounds as well. And they know this is all coming together. They know what we're doing, what Mark's doing, and Michael Anderson's doing. They know this is making the whole of our acquisition, our theft of this country. We knew we were stealing this land, and we knew that other people had already signed treaties with them. The Spanish, you've got to remember, when the Spanish were actually involved in this, they just got the shit knocked out of them by the English. They'd been the king of the waves. The English didn't even sail boats 200 years before. In the 1500s, they only had dinghies then. They had no part of this. But by that stage, they'd lost a lot of it. And they were fighting against the English and losing. Why fight for Australia? You're losing a lot of other places in the meantime, aren't you? And they were more concerned about the other places that were a better source of income. So I just think that they just didn't bother, simply because they were losing other places, and they wanted to hang on to what they could in South America, and they were losing some of that. They'd lost America. They knew that was going to the English. They were worried about the English taking over everywhere. So when you prioritise things and what you fight for, you look at the place that's the furthest from Spain, you think, well, I'm just going to have to just let that one go. But yeah, the king has got the treaty. You ask McMurtry and those guys, they know about that treaty. It's there. So it does make an issue. And by the way, I think the Egyptians have been told about this too. They've been informed also that they've got some claims there. In fact, to be honest, I think the Gosford glyphs, a bit like Turkey. You know, the Turks have given part of where we go each year as sort of special ground, special English ground.
Yep.
I think those glyphs should get the same recognition, because I think they mark a very important part of England, of our history, Aboriginal history and Egyptian history. So I think it should mark especially.
Well, we've been talking for nearly 2 hours, but before we go, I want to get back to the esoteric a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it was on one of the radio shows that we did together that you mentioned don't know what you called it, a Stargate maybe, around Mount Warning that belongs to the Hopi.
Oh, yes, yeah. Yeah, that's a strange one. Now, again, this is second-hand and first-hand on some occasions, this one. But there is a place up here, Arnie Millie Boyd, who I have the greatest respect for. She was the last person around that knew all the old stuff. This comes from her. If it comes from her, I take it as gospel. She was in contact with a lady called Anne Schaefer Wilson, who wrote a wonderful book called Native Wisdom for White Minds. And there's a series of accounts there. And I've also heard her speak about this. I've got an account that she gave in the 1950s, and I've got an account that was done on tape. She speaks about what's called White Buffalo Mountain. And she took a woman there, an American woman there, that wanted to see her ancestor. And she said when she was taken there, the ancestor came through the channel, who was dead, came through the channel from America, came through this channel and appeared to her. And she saw her. And according to Arnie Millie, there's a part of that region we're living in now that doesn't belong to Australia. It belongs to the Hopi. Now, the Hopi have a legend about the Red City to the south, about the place they came from. And they were guided from this place from what they call Kachina men. We have what's called Kadija men. They're the secret men, very similar pronunciation. And my understanding is the channel or portal is that this mountain near Mount Warning. I don't know exactly where it is. I know roughly where it is. And it's called White Buffalo Mountain. And now the Hopi apparently each year come up to Mount Warning and do sacred ceremonies around there and give reverence to this place. And they're the only group I know of in Australia that are allowed to carry out their own ceremonies on this land, and no one gets in their way. So when you put that all together, And of course, the Hopi, and I know I've had quite recently a Dunghutti elder went across and spoke to the Hopi, and the Hopi say that the people who stood first on the earth come from Australia, not from there, but from Australia. They all say that over that way. Knowing that they do their ceremonies here, knowing that Auntie Millie Boyd gave it the name White Buffalo Mountain, and we know what the White Buffalo means to the American Indian people, there's got to be one there. It's come from her, and that's good enough for me. And I know that people have actually had experiences where their spirits have come across through that portal. And according to them, they were taken through that portal to where they are now. And they're the custodians. For me, they seem to be the custodians of the old way there. And they have this link here that hasn't been broken.
So do you think that living Hopi in America now can still use that portal to come here?
I think
Or is it
so.
only for spirits?
Maybe for spirits, I'm not sure how they use it, but I think they come back each year to keep it going. And I think that I know that that spirit came through there. And I know that this woman knows about that place and knows about the portal also, and she wrote about it. So I know that I know the Hopi know about it. Of course they know about it. And I'm not so sure who knows about it here. I think there's a couple that do. I would think that the family, and I know the family of Auntie Millie Boyd, there'll be people there that know something about that place. And I've got tapes of her talking about it.
Well, she would have had to pass that on to someone, surely.
Oh, yeah, but that's not for me to know. But see, it'll be passed on to a woman, so therefore it won't be for me to know, will it?
Yeah.
But I'm sure that there's someone. We suspect that there could be a couple of women who could know, and we suspect we know who their names are, but we don't know for sure. But Auntie Millie certainly talks about White Buffalo Mountain and makes it very clear it's theirs. Says that all the way along, and this woman makes it really clear. She makes it clear that it also belongs to them. See, there's an esoteric story that runs all the way through there. The American Indians are part of that story, of course, very similar, and the Gnostics are part of it too. So it's in all the religions, it's still there. We just have to contact back again.
Well, Stephen, as more information comes to light in terms of the message for this year and, preparing the world for what to expect and what's to come, as that information comes to light, please share it and, we'll get it out there. Yeah, it's been awesome. Always enjoy talking to you, always.
That was a good interview. You did well. I enjoyed that.
Oh, good.